Again, I want to thank Julia and David for inviting me here to talk to you about something that's very near and dear to my heart, the Forest Vegetation Simulator. I've been working for the FVS group out of Fort Collins for the last 6 years, and when Tara got a job here as a research forester, we arranged it for me to work remotely from here. I'm going to begin my presentation with giving you some information about that unit I worked for back in Fort Collins called the Forest Management Service Center. Then I'll slide into a general overview of what FVS is and what it can do. And I'll follow that by going a little bit deeper into the FVS system components. And I'll finish up with a nice example of how you could use FVS in these forest types to look at resource management alternatives. Let's start out by talking about the Forest Management Service Center. This is actually a remotely located Washington office, Forest Service Washington office unit, meaning that it's national in scope, and it provides a service to the Forest Service for the entire Forest Service throughout the United States. It's within the Forest Management Service Center. We have a number of biometricians and mensurationists whose goal is to provide biometric services to the National Forest System. As such, we provide products such as products and technical support for forest vegetation modeling and forest products measurements to the National Forest and our partners in research, as well as state and private agencies. Within the Service Center, there are two working groups. There's the Forest Products Measurements Group and the Forest Vegetation Simulator Group. The Products Measurements Group supports the Forest Service Forest Product Sales Program, and they do so by providing software and expertise in timber cruising, scaling, volume estimation, and area determination. Those of us in the Forest Vegetation Simulator Group, we support forest management activities and analyses by providing a nationally supported framework for forest growth and yield modeling, and that is the Forest Vegetation Simulator. And pretty much anytime anyone talks about the Forest Vegetation Simulator, they refer to it as FVS. Within the group, we provide the FVS software as well as the documentation and training guides via our FVS website. We also maintain and enhance the FVS source code, as well as develop new variants of the model. We assist with FVS-related projects. For instance, I'm currently working with some Washington office organizations in a project where we're computing the carbon benefit from planting certain areas throughout the United States. We provide user support via our FVS hotlines, and at the end of the presentation, there'll be a slide that shows the hotline number as well as my number where you can call if you have any questions about it. And we provide annual FVS trainings for all the national U.S. Forest Service regions. In addition to these regionally specific trainings that we provide, we also put on special trainings. During this last year, I put on 2 trainings for the Colorado State Forest Service, where we trained over 40 state foresters in using the FVS system. So we occasionally, if there's a big enough demand, we'll put on a special training. So let's slide into a general overview of what FVS is. And first, let's just look at a basic description. FVS is a computer simulation model that predicts tree growth and changes in stand characteristics over time. And it does this both with and without management to simulate the natural as well as man-made disturbances that a stand might see over the simulation time frame. In terms of where FVS is calibrated, there are 20 plus different versions of FVS, and each version is called a geographic variant. And you can see way down here in the southeast United States, we have one variant that represents the southern area. And initially, when I mentioned this, everyone always goes, Ooh, one variant for an entire area? Well, it's okay because within this variant, we have unique growth, mortality, and volume equations that are specific to individual locations, as well as forest types and ecological land classification within that area. So you're not growing oak based on relationships in Arkansas here, okay? In addition to these base models of FVS, we have what's called the fire and fuels extension. And this is a nice extension to the model that started in the late 90s, and we've pretty much developed it for the rest of the United States since then. And basically anything in red in this slide are active fire and fuels extension variants. You'll notice that the southern variant, it's only red over here for the Ozark-Washita area. That's because when we created the southern variant fire and fuels extension, we fit the relationships basically just to this one location. Since then, we've been working with Southern Research Station as well as some professors at Virginia Tech to expand it throughout the whole southern region. And we actually feel really comfortable with our users using it throughout the southern region currently. We just need to do some fine tuning of that model. What's nice about the fire and fuels extension is that it models snags over time, as well as fuels within the stand, both standing and surface fuels. In addition to modeling the surface fuels and the snags, we have a fire submodel which allows the user to simulate fires as well as predict fire effects on the forested stands. In terms of who uses FVS, let's first look at the agencies. And we could continue this list on and on and on. Basically, if you're a forestry professional who needs to base a decision off of forest stand characteristics, then you could use FVS. It's that powerful or that robust. Within each one of those agencies, the main question, basically any silviculturist, wildlife biologist, ecologist, and so on, again, who needs to base a decision off of future stand attributes could use our model because that's what FVS does. It predicts the future outcomes of stands under various alternatives. Not only is FVS fit to forested areas within the United States, but it's also being developed or has been developed in a host of other countries. The variant that's being used in Russia is actually our northeast variant. And if you think about a globe and how that boreal forest just circumvents the globe, it's actually been doing quite well and it's been performing quite well in eastern Russia. And it's being used there to predict tiger habitat over the next few decades. So it's kind of interesting. I'm just going to go ahead and click through these bullets real quick. But basically, FVS works at the stand level. So when David said in his introductory presentation that silviculture is applied at the stand level, well, so is FVS. FVS works at the stand level. You put your treatments in at the stand level. And then through aggregations of multiple stands, you can do project level analyses or forest level analyses or even regional level analyses. The central question that's often asked when using FVS is, does the residual forest condition, based on our different alternatives that we might do, meet some future desired condition? And that could be in terms of timber yields, wildlife habitat, vegetative structural stages, visual qualities, fire hazard or insect or pathogen hazard ratings, or this last one here, which is the newest addition to the model, carbon sequestration. Okay, so now that you have a general idea of what FVS is, let me go a little bit more detailed into the system components that make up the Forest Vegetation Simulator. In terms of the system components, there are four main categories. The first category are preprocessors. These are programs that are used to get your inventory data from your stand exams into a format that the growth model can understand. The next category is the actual growth and yield model that contains all the regionally specific growth growth and volume equations. After you do an FVS simulation, there are a number of these post-processors also that can be used to tailor the FVS outputs to help you answer your questions. And finally, we have the suppose interface, which is the graphical user interface that most of our users use to interact with the whole system. In fact, our training program, for our regional training program, in which we go out to regions and put on trainings, lasts for 4 days. And that 4 days is spent pretty much learning this suppose interface and how to put your information into FVS and perform management actions and so on. In terms of preprocessors, these are things, like I said, that do something with inventory data, and then they also put the data into an FVS format. The main one within the US Forest Service is this thing called FVS. And it's a program, it's actually a national database or database repository for all the stand exam data throughout the Forest Service. And it's centrally located in Kansas City. Well, this program has, the computer program to FVS contains a utility that will take that stand exam data in Kansas City and download it to your machine in FVS-ready format. In addition to FVS, we've worked with other agencies to develop translators to help them get inventory data into FVS. Forest Inventory Analysis, FIA data, can be directly downloaded into our format from their website. National agencies like BIA, BLM have their own translator programs. And recently, along with those Colorado State trainings that I put on, we're helping them develop a translator so their foresters can basically take the inventory data with the field recorder in the field, click a button when they get back to the computers, and have the information already put into FVS format. If I skip over the growth and yield model for a minute and go to the other side of things, let's talk about post-processors. And like I said before, these are programs that further analyze FVS output. And you can get things such as stand and stock tables, structure and habitat indices, hazard ratings for both insects, pathogens, as well as fire. And probably the most popular one that you're seeing in the lower right of this screen are computer visualizations using the SVS, which stands for Stand Visualization Software Program. That's a unique post-processor of ours because we don't actually maintain it. We just provide it with our software and give it the necessary output files for it to go ahead and make these nice movies and such. And like I said before, after our trainings, most of our users will not be sitting here like this trying to figure out how to use the suppose interface to run the model. It's actually pretty straightforward when you get down to it. The suppose interface has undergone a pretty big transformation over the last year. If you're familiar with using FVS in college or in your professional work, this is a screenshot of the latest version of FVS and the suppose interface, and it officially hasn't been released yet, but it will be released in the next couple weeks or so. So let's go back and talk about the growth and yield model a little bit. And sometimes when you talk about growth and yield models, people like to think of them just as a little black box there that's doing its thing. Well, let's try to open it up a little bit and talk about what that growth and yield model is. In terms of being a growth model, it's considered a distance-independent individual tree, self-calibrating growth model comprised of empirical equations that predict diameter and height growth, crown change, and mortality of individual trees over time. It's quite a mouthful. That's why I read it. But basically, what it's saying is that this individual tree part means from your inventory, we take those individual tree records and we grow them over time. And we base that off of plot level attributes and stand level attributes, as well as individual tree attributes. A unique feature to the FVS modeling world is this process of self-calibration. And I'll talk about that again in a little bit, but basically what it does is allow within the model, if you provide it a sample of growth from your inventory, it'll self-calibrate itself to better predict the stand growth into the future. It's kind of unique. Not many other models have that. So as this model grows trees over time, occasionally or periodically, it'll produce stand statistics for you. So it'll sum up those individual tree records at specific intervals and allow you to get attributes out, 5, 10 years in the future, 50 years, 100 years into the future. In terms of the processing sequence of FVS, the first thing it does is to read inventory data. And during that time, it does that self-calibration process where it looks at growth measurements that you've provided and calibrates its growth routines based on that. Once it does that, FVS goes through a process of growing the trees for specific periods of time, what we call FVS growth cycles. And during each cycle, what FVS does is it goes ahead and performs the management activities, it grows the trees, it kills some trees off based on density-related mortality, updates the crown of trees, and then it updates the stand statistics. And at the end of the projection, it writes some output tables for you to view. So let's go into, let me go back for a second. Let's go into some of these categories here real quick. And let's talk about data requirements. There are two types of data that FVS wants to see. There's stand level attributes and there are tree level attributes. In terms of stand level attributes, it's looking to get some information about that specific stand. So information that tells it where the stand is on the landscape in terms of slope, aspect, elevation, as well as some measurement of site. As Henry was talking about earlier this week when we went out there, we talked about site indices, which FVS can use. It also uses this ecological land unit classification scheme to help get at site productivity so that it can more accurately grow trees in the future. In terms of tree level attributes, there's actually only two things that FVS requires, and that's species and DBH. That's all you need to give it for FVS to grow the tree. The one caveat with that is if all you give it is species and DBH, it's probably not going to do a great job of predicting height or height growth, let alone crown change over time. So the more information that you can give the model, the better its future predictions are going to be. And for instance, I often recommend to people, not based on cost or anything, but in terms of the model, what is needed is basically species DBH, a subsample of the heights, and an estimate of crown ratio on individual trees. And you could think about, well, why does FVS need crown ratio? Well, think about that photosynthetic capacity of an individual tree is going to be related to how much leaf material is out there. So by providing FVS estimates of the site and the vigor of each individual tree through crown ratio, FVS can produce better estimates in terms of diameter growth, height growth, ultimately mortality, and crown change over time. Now this slide is broken up into two categories, large tree growth and small tree growth, and it's an artificial classification within the models where small trees we grow height first, and from height we estimate diameter growth, and in large trees we grow diameter first, and from that diameter growth we estimate height growth. And it just has to do with the nature of the equations in the model and how they were originally fit. All right, what I want to do is talk about some of these, actually let me go back, some of these boxes here that are off on the right. I could go much more in detail about the growth, mortality, and crown change routines, but we do that in our trainings. So if you come to our trainings, you can get a wealth of information about about those model components. But let's talk about these over on the right here in terms of regeneration, the fire and fields extension, and some insect and pathogen adjustments you can make in the model. In terms of regeneration, there's two types of regeneration models within FVS. There's what we call the full establishment model, which is only used in a few of our variants in the western United States. And basically what they're comprised of are equations that if you disturb the stand enough, you're going to get automatic regeneration put into the model for you. In addition to that, throughout the stand projection, it's going to look at the stand, the regeneration model is going to look at the stand characteristics and predict what species are going to grow into the stand. So it has this automatic ingrowth function too. Well, that's not available to most of our users. In fact, most of our models do have this partial establishment model. And in this case, the only automatic regeneration you're going to get following a disturbance is automatic sprouting. And it's a very coarse sprouting model. Okay? But we allow the users to manually input their expected regeneration. So when David was talking yesterday about the regen model, and you went and had that exercise, you could, based on using his model, look at the stand and input what amount of regeneration that model is predicting into our model. In fact, over the next year, I'll be working with David to get a better connection between the FVS growth and yield model and his regen model, so we can fine-tune that and get it to be more automatic, where you guys don't have to run two models separately to find out that information. Okay, let's switch over to the fire and fuels extension and talk about it. In terms of the snag model, during an FVS simulation, trees are going to die, or you could put in instructions to kill trees if you want. And those trees, once they're dead, they go into the snag model, where height loss as well as decay of those snags is modeled, and ultimately fall rate, the fall down of those snags, is going to be simulated. When snags fall to the forest floor, as well as when crowns start breaking or leaves fall off every fall, they get put into this fuel model, which estimates surface and standing fuel loads within the stand. And it does so by allowing for accumulation as well as decay rates within that fuel model. And finally, we have the fire model, which allows the user to simulate fires as well as obtain potential effects from fire. So you could run your simulation without putting any fire into it and get the likely fire severity based off of your input fire conditions with the fire model. In terms of insect and pathogen modeling, we have the dwarf mistletoe model in all our western United States variants. And then in addition to that, we have individual, what we call X extensions, which contain insect and pathogen models for individual items in the stand over time. For instance, mountain pine beetle in the west, root disease in the west. There are separate models that predict the effects of those agents on forested stands. As Steve mentioned earlier, in the eastern United States, the forest health specialists decided not to go into this really detailed model building process of creating these X extensions for FVS. Instead, they went to this process of creating add files. And these are somewhat simple add files that you can bring into an FVS simulation that will report things like gypsy moth hazard rating, gypsy moth impacts, oak decline impacts, southern pine beetle impacts on that forested stand over a projection cycle. And the really nice thing about those is that they're easy to use. You can add them into any simulation, and you wind up getting more realistic results in your growth projections when you do so. When you leave these things out, the growth projections tend to be a little bit over-optimistic. Okay, so now that I talked about the system components, let's just go over a quick FVS example. And I'm going to apologize for this slide, seeing that there's so much information written on it. But basically, let's break it down. into this. Let's first look at the stand conditions. This stand was inventoried in 1990, and it was comprised of an oak-dominated overstory with a red maple dogwood mid-story. And based on what David talked about yesterday, there probably isn't much oak regeneration in this stand. So the owner is a little bit worried about the future development of this stand, especially given the fact that the oak overstory has been declining over the last few years. And in fact, it's been about 10% mortality every 5 years for a while now. Okay, so maybe the objective here would be to regenerate oak in this upland oak stand, and then see, well, that would be the objective. So we could look at a number of different alternatives, and we're going to focus on 2 of them. We're going to focus first on this alternative 1, which is a no action taken, which we can take this inventory, put it into FVS, and grow it for 100 years. Now I've added in some minor oak decline within this model, and that it was a pretty coarse level of decline that I've added. Basically, I just took this 10% mortality and added it into the model. A more advanced way to do it would be to use the oak decline event monitor that Steve Oak and others have developed. Okay. The second alternative is this modified shelterwood regeneration harvest, where we're going to go into the stand and kill the undesirable tree species in the mid-story to try to open it up. So in fact, we're going to look at killing the red maple and dogwood via herbicides. And then 10 years later, we'll come back and remove that oak overstory and then grow it out for the next 100 years. Okay, what this slide has here are those two alternatives. On the left is the no action alternative. On the right is the shelterwood alternative. Starting out with the same stand, and when I click the button, it's going to grow each stand over time. And these results here are from the SVS post-processor. So over time, you can see those stands developing. And pretty dramatic over on the right as we did the regeneration harvest and the removal. One thing you can notice on the left here is this is just normal stand dynamics with that decline in the oak overstory being simulated. And what you see here at the end of the simulation are two very distinct stand structures. Here's one where the red maple have expanded and taken over the overstory as those oaks have died out. Still has that mid-story of dogwood sitting around there. And over on the right, we have just this big green glob of we don't know what yet with the SVS images. All right? I suspect that this is probably oak given the prescription that we've given. So from this, we can move over into some tabular results that FVS produces and start looking at some detailed stand statistics. And the 3 that I chose to look at today are cover type, percent canopy cover, and oak, the amount of oak basal area within the stand. In alternative 1, you can see that the percent canopy cover is pretty well maintained throughout the whole projection, ranging around 80 to 90% canopy cover. And however, the oak basal area drops from about 83 in 1990 down to 20 square feet by the end. All right, that oak overstory was dying out. The red maple and dogwood were taking over that site. Corresponding with that, we have a cover type change, and this is being predicted within the model on the fly. And it says, in a general sense, it's an oak hickory type stand, but 50, 60 years down the line, it switches to this other hardwoods category because the oak have died out. In alternative 2, if we look at canopy cover, it quickly drops off when we do the regeneration harvest, but then comes back to a level around 80% throughout the rest of the projection. Notice that cover type doesn't change throughout the entire projection because based on our prescription, we're able to get oak to regenerate and to respond well. And in fact, it went back up to about 80, 90, up to 120 square feet of basal area within that stand. Okay. Now, so these are just some standard outputs by FVS. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm working on this carbon report for the Washington office. So I decided to produce some carbon outputs for these 2 alternatives. And what we have here is the total stand carbon on the leftmost axis, or I mean on the y-axis, and the age of the stand over time on the x-axis. The blue line here is the no-action alternative. And what we see is that the amount of carbon in the stand stays pretty level for the next 60 years and then starts to increase with that forest type change. Well, it's staying level because we're killing off that oak overstory over time. If that oak overstory wasn't dying, it probably would have increased slightly over time. As the red maples start to come into codominant dominant status and they're continuing to grow, then you see a slight increase in the amount of total carbon within that stand. The red line here represents the total carbon within the stand with the shelterwood regeneration alternative. And as you might expect, carbon drops way down when you take out a bunch of wood, right? Makes sense. And then it increases, and it increases at a faster rate than the no-action alternative because we have a young, vigorous stand growing over time. This green line here includes not only the stand component, but the fate of that harvested trees over time. And in fact, it includes the carbon from that's in the stand from the red line, plus the amount of carbon that's being stored in products and landfills the amount of carbon that's being stored in products and landfills. And what you can notice there, the big take-home thing there is that initially we have about 10 tons of carbon stored in products. Well, over the lifespan, that drops down to about 5 tons as that carbon's being emitted back to the atmosphere and used for energy and so on. Okay. So this is an example of how you can use FVS to examine trade-offs for your stand projections, or for a specific stand. And we can just summarize it by looking at alternative 1, where, well, if we don't do anything, we're going to have forest type change. Oak's going to drop out. All the volume that's currently in oak is going to be left in the stand, and it's going to fall over and decay. But the one nice thing is that carbon stocks stay the same, or stay level. And you might start getting users or owners over the next few years that ask you a lot of questions about carbon sequestration, because there's a lot of agencies out there that are, and carbon markets out there which have some cost share benefits and will actually pay people to keep the carbon in the forested stand over time rather than harvesting. So this might actually be a legitimate thing for you guys later on in the next few years. In terms of the shelterwood alternative, it's looking a lot better in terms of maintaining oak in the stand. No forest type change. Oak stocking remains high. Of the volume that's harvested, we're able to harvest that oak volume and sell it. And the one caveat, though, is that initially our carbon stocks decrease, but over time they rebound. Okay, so with that, I hope that I've kind of wet your whistle a little bit on FVS. And I just want to summarize here and state that FVS is a growth modeling system that allows you to forecast stand development throughout time and incorporate various disturbances, whether they be silvicultural disturbances, insect pathogen disturbance, wind disturbances, fire, etc. And when you do these simulations, what you can then do is compare the relative difference between different alternatives. And that's the important thing, that relative difference, the do nothing versus do something or do something else. That's what FVS is really designed to do. Okay. In terms of finding out more information about FVS, you can go to our website. You can call me directly. We have an FVS hotline here. Also, my phone number is an FVS hotline. You can call me anytime and I'll answer your questions. If your agency is interested in getting an FVS training, we can come out and perform either two-day training, 3-day trainings, up to our standard 4-day trainings for you. And in fact, in September, I'm going to go out to the Cherokee reservation and give a training out there for 5 or 6 of their foresters. Generally, we want to do these trainings for at least 5 to 10 people or so. Okay? All right, with that, I'll end.